is there any evidence indicating that Biden himself was involved in approving these pardons? Real hard evidence?
There really isn't, and it's astonishing when you're talking about thousands of pardons and dozens of executive orders.
If you've been following the chaos around the Biden pardon scandal, buckle up, because the story somehow gets stranger every time someone opens their mouth in Washington. And what makes it all so wild is that Biden's own aides apparently thought the whole thing would stay buried forever. Thousands of pardons, some involving violent criminals, quietly pushed through at the end of his presidency under circumstances that now look, frankly, unbelievable. And we're going to break all of it down in a way that finally makes sense. But real quick, this channel is brand new and built for people who want actual debate, not partisan cheerleading. So if you believe the truth shouldn't come with a team jersey, hit that subscribe button right now and let's jump in. Because once you understand what happened here, your jaw might hit the floor. Almost 4,500 pardons, yes, 4,500, were pushed through, many involving individuals with murder convictions, violent drug offenses, and histories that would normally trigger multiple red flags in a vetting process.
4,500 pardons that were issued, and to some of them, it was murderers, it was violent criminals.
Except here's the plot twist. There was barely any vetting at all. According to reports, top contributors like Lydia Hu pointed out that these weren't harmless low-level offenders. These were serious cases, serious people, and apparently nobody seemed bothered enough to slow down and ask, who exactly are we releasing back into society? And as if that wasn't enough to raise alarms, the more investigators dug in, the more bizarre the whole thing looked. Because it wasn't just who was being pardoned, it was how the pardons were being signed. Enter the Autopen, yes, the machine that signs documents for the president when he's unavailable, or in theory when circumstances require it. Except evidence started popping up suggesting Biden's inner circle may have used the Autopen to sign off on official documents, including pardons, without the president's direct approval. Some staffers even admitted they never once heard directly from Biden about authorization.
No one who authorized Autopen or actually physically manually pressed the power button on Autopen ever heard directly from Joe Biden.
Think about that. People physically pressing a button to apply the president's signature, but never hearing a word from the president himself. How does that even happen? This is where the whole thing goes from sloppy to suspicious. Because if there's one thing the government is supposed to be good at, it's paperwork. There should be a chain of custody, records, a clear process. Instead, emails from inside the administration show confusion, hesitation, and pushback from staff who didn't understand why the Autopen was suddenly being used so aggressively. It's almost like the inside of the White House looked exactly like what the outside world sees. Chaos, improvisation, and a whole lot of don't ask questions, just do it.
Makes this story important is that you see pushback from within the administration, emails that show a confusion about the use of the Autopen and wondering and questions about why it's being used. And let's play this from Lydia Moynihan, who talked about this, one of the contributors here at Fox.
You're talking about almost 4,500 pardons that were issued, and to some of them, it was murderers, it was violent criminals, it was people with violent drug histories. They weren't vetting any of those folks who were being pardoned. Again, that raises concerns about who these people are, whether they deserve to be free. And so I think we need answers about who was released, why they were released, and who ultimately is responsible for it.
Mark, your reaction?
Well, look, the Department of Justice works for the President of the United States. They're not an independent branch of government. So at the end of the day, whether or not the Department of Justice is directly involved or not with the pardon process really doesn't matter. If the president wants to give someone a pardon or grant clemency, he has the authority to do so, which goes back to, did Joe Biden really sign off on this or not? Now, usually the Department of Justice is involved. They put together the paperwork, they put together the documents for the president to sign. But the fact that they didn't do it, arguably, doesn't change the legal nature of this. At the end of the day, did Joe Biden sign off on these or not?
For context, this information surfaced over the summer and raised some serious questions.
Mark, one of the commentators weighing in on this, made a point that's impossible to ignore. The Department of Justice ultimately works for the president. They're not an independent branch. So whether the DOJ prepared the documents or not, the real question that matters is simple. Did Joe Biden actually sign off on any of these pardons? Or were staffers making decisions for him and slapping his signature on afterward? Imagine your boss telling you, yeah, go ahead and approve everything, and walking away without looking at a single sheet of paper. Most companies would fire you for doing that, but in the White House, Apparently it was business as usual. This is exactly why the House Oversight Committee got involved, and they weren't subtle about what they found. When they interviewed Biden's staff, every single person had a different version of how the Autopen was used. Different rules, different stories, no consistency. It was like interviewing 10 people who all swear they saw the same car accident, except one saw a motorcycle, one saw a boat, and one wasn't even on the street that day. Then came the DOJ emails, the Merrick Garland DOJ expressing concern about how often the Autopen was being used.
Is there any evidence indicating that Biden himself was involved in approving these pardons? Real hard evidence.
There really isn't, and it's astonishing when you're talking about thousands of pardons and dozens of executive orders. Basically, any legal document, especially during the last 3 months of the Biden administration, that's what we focused on. And every person who we deposed had a different story on what the proper process was that they followed in using the Autopen to sign a legal document. Their stories were inconsistent, and then when you throw in the emails from the Merrick Garland Department of Justice expressing concern to these very staffers about the excessive use of the Autopen and asking point-blank questions, what was their process, then the entire story's changed. So the inconsistencies are abound, but one thing that is consistent, Laura, is the fact that no one saw Joe Biden, no one who authorized the Autopen or even gave the authorization to use the Autopen, no one who authorized Autopen.
That's a massive statement. Thousands of pardons, gone, erased, invalid. It would be one of the most significant reversals in presidential history, but even that wasn't the end of the chaos, because then we get to the testimony from Biden's top aides. And this part, this is where you really start wondering who was actually running the White House. Neera Tanden, the White House staff secretary, one of the closest positions to the president, told investigators she didn't know what happened to the decision book after she handed it off to the operations team. It came back with Biden's signature, but she had no idea who reviewed it, who handled it, or who pressed the button on the Autopen. Biden's chief of staff didn't know who used the Autopen either. And then, casually thrown in like it's no big deal, we hear that Hunter Biden was participating in some of the pardon discussions. Why? In what capacity? Who let that happen? Nobody seems to have an answer. That's why the committee wrote that Biden's executive decision-making process was so lax, so unorganized, that it was almost impossible to establish a clear chain of custody for any decision.
Are you of the view that, for instance, Biden's pardon of his brother, Jim, or let's say Anthony Fauci, are you of the view that those pardons are null and void, given what you know?
I am. Absolutely, 100%. If anyone doubts whether or not there was a cover-up, they need to watch every minute of the testimony that we got, all of the hours and hours of depositions from these staffers, where you had people like Ian Sams, who was his spokesperson, who would come out every day and give press conferences blasting me or blasting Robert Hur or Jim Jordan or someone. Under oath, when we asked him, how many times did you meet directly with Joe Biden? He said 2 times in 2 years. Neera Tanden, his executive secretary, well, 2 times in 2 years. Neera Tanden then, who's his executive secretary, who that position is one of the closest to the president, whether it's Obama, Trump, George Bush, Obama, she admitted that she would go weeks without having any interaction with Joe Biden. They clearly shielded him, not only from the American people, but from their inner staff.
That's when James Comer dropped the biggest shock of all. He said staffers like Ian Sams, Biden's spokesperson, the guy who went on TV to defend the administration, admitted under oath that he met with Biden only twice in 2 years. Neera Tanden said she could go weeks without interacting with him. Weeks! That means one of the most critical gatekeepers to presidential decision-making wasn't actually seeing the president. So who was making the decisions? CNN's Jake Tapper even wrote about a cabinet secretary who said access to Biden dropped off significantly in 2024. The official then asked the question everyone has been thinking: if Biden's inner circle is shaping the decisions before they ever reach him, is he really the one deciding anything? Whatever your politics are, that should worry you. But wait, there's more. A lawyer asked perhaps the most pressing question: is there any legal way to challenge these pardons? Federal courts rarely touch pardon power. It's considered absolute and unreviewable. They usually call this kind of thing a political question. Translation: not our problem.
I'm a lawyer, so I'm going to ask you this. Is there really any legal means of challenging these pardons? I mean, I don't see any federal court that wants to get involved in what seems to be unknowable with the president's plenary pardon power. I think they're going to call it a political question and say we're not getting involved.
Well, that's why we brought Dr. O'Connor in, the White House physician, and we asked him the first question, Dr. O'Connor, were you ever told to lie about Joe Biden's health? And he pled the Fifth Amendment. We had so many questions about the mental fitness. What we found in the investigation also was the fact that President Biden's staff talked about whether or not they should give him a cognitive test, and then according to the staffers, they ultimately decided to not give him a cognitive test. Now, that makes no sense. If you wanted to prove to the skeptics in the media and the skeptics in the Republican Party that the president was mentally fit for office, why not give him a cognitive test?
This leaves us with a picture that's deeply concerning. A president who may not have been mentally or physically capable of reviewing the pardons bearing his name, surrounded by staffers who were already limiting his access to his own administration, while thousands of life-altering legal decisions were rushed through in the final months. Congress laid out the framework. Bondi now has to decide what happens next and what, if anything, can be done to restore transparency and trust in the presidential pardon process. But the truth is, if this isn't handled properly, we're setting a dangerous precedent. Future presidents, Republican or Democrat, could exploit the exact same loopholes. And once we accept government by Autopen, government without accountability, government by staffers instead of elected officials, we might never get back to a functioning system. So now the question is for you. Should these pardons be invalidated? Should there be a legal challenge? Should Congress push for laws requiring paper trails and documented presidential involvement? Or do you think this is all political theater designed to score points? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, because this story affects everyone regardless of party. And if you haven't already, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next deep dive.